It's genuinely incredible how some debates in fiction they refuse to die.
They just keep going.
Yeah, we are nearing a decade since Star Wars. The Last Jedi came out, and somehow the controversy over Luke Skywalker's character...
Oh, it's as fresh as ever.
It really is. Specifically his decision to exile himself on Octu. It just seems to ignite the entire digital galaxy every, few months? It's the debate that just keeps on.
It's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And the longevity of it, the intensity, it's not really about whether people just liked or disliked the movie as a movie. It goes so much deeper than that.
Right.
It cuts to the fundamental narrative, the character direction for one of the most beloved heroes in, modern mythology. Fans invested decades of their lives, their hopes, their entire understanding of heroism into Luke. So when that growth seemed to some people to be completely thrown out or even reversed, the emotional stakes just became astronomical.
Exactly. And today, we're not going to just rehash the old arguments. Was Rian Johnson right? Was he wrong? We're going to dive deep into a very specific and highly controversial analogy that was dropped online recently by a pretty vocal defender of the...
And this person, they tried to settle the debate once and for all.
Right. By comparing Luke's exile directly, and I mean unequivocally, to the exile of his two great mentors, Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi.
So our source material for this deep dive is really crucial here. We are looking at a very robust critical reaction. It came from a publication called The Trent Report, and it was responding to a post made by Jeremy Conrad.
Who also goes by Manabite.
Right, Manabite. He shared it on X and Substack. And our mission here, just to be clear, it isn't to pick a side in the endless fandom war.
Of course not.
It's to analyze the specific structural foundation of this defense, and more importantly, to really understand why critics argued it was a total and complete failure, or to use one of the most cutting terms we found.
Total cope out.
Exactly, a total cope out.
Okay, so let's unpack this for you, the learner. We're committed to moving past the simple, kind of lazy, surface-level comparison. The kind of thing that says, guy goes into hiding, check. Another guy goes into hiding, check.
Therefore, all hiding is the same. It's flawed logic.
It is. Instead, we're going to uncover how the specific foundational elements, the narrative purpose, the operational context of their missions, the deep character motive, how all of that makes these three exiles fundamentally, critically, and really irrevocably different.
And that's where we find that aha moment. That's what separates, shallow meme-based analysis from a true, detailed narrative understanding.
Precisely. We need to define the difference between a retreat that's caused by, say, a systemic disaster and a retreat that's driven by a personal psychological failure.
And that distinction, that is the bedrock of this entire contract.
So let's start with the flashpoint, the spark that lit this whole thing up again. Jeremy Conrad, he clearly intended to provoke a reaction.
And boy, did he succeed. Based on the blowback, he succeeded wildly.
He used a very blunt, intentionally simplistic meme-like format. And our source material noted it was designed to bludgeon fans who just refuse to accept The Last Jedi's portrayal of Luke.
The whole format was highly rhetorical. It relied on making this seemingly undeniable parallel and then using that parallel to accuse the critics of being inconsistent.
It was simple. It was repetitive.
Totally. It was aiming for a quick emotional knockout punch based on this idea of, perceived fan hypocrisy.
And the analogy structure itself went something like this. It painted these three neat little columns for comparison. First up, Yoda.
Right.
Failure sends him into hiding. He becomes a crazed hermit. Star Wars fans, Yoda is awesome.
Okay, so it establishes a pattern. Then it moves to Obi-Wan Kenobi. Failure sends him into hiding. He becomes a crazed hermit.
And again, Star Wars fans, Obi-Wan is awesome.
So it's setting up this clear, incredibly simplified historical pattern that the audience has already bought into.
And then, bam, the punchline. The rhetorical trap aimed right at the critics of The Last Jedi. Luke Skywalker.
Here it comes.
Failure sends him into hiding. He becomes a crazed hermit. Star Wars fans, this character assassination has literally destroyed Star Wars forever.
And the implication there, the thing that fueled all the outrage, was just crystal clear. It was saying, if you accepted this crazed hermit hiding for the older established heroes, then you rejecting it for Luke, well, that must just be inconsistent fan outrage.
It's rooted in entitlement, basically, not a genuine principled narrative.
Exactly. It's an attempt to invalidate the entire criticism by just reducing these really complex character arcs to 3 bullet.
What's immediately fascinating here is the sheer volume and the emotional intensity of the blowback Conrad got on X.
Oh, it was huge. The sources note that he had to limit the replies very shortly after posting it.
Which is a powerful metric in itself. It says the volume of critical reaction was so high, so immediate, that he basically had to just shut down the conversation.
That action alone just speaks volumes about how poorly the analogy landed.
Yep.
This wasn't just a few negative comments. It was a flood of intense disagreement.
Yeah.
And we have that one specific detail, which is fantastic, about the person who managed to get a comment in just before the limits were imposed.
Right. What did he say?
He just wrote, "Thanks, I've got an article to write for tomorrow now."
That's perfect. That detail is so critical. It highlights that the critics didn't just feel insulted. They immediately seized on it. They saw it not as a valid defense, but as a perfect, easy to dissect example of what they call the total cope-out.
It gave them a target, a specific structural target to dismantle, instead of just, vaguely arguing about the film's quality in general terms.
Absolutely. And you have to look at the language the critics used in the source material. It's incredibly charged.
Words like pitiable.
Absolutely wrong.
And they point out that the comparison is based on lying.
Why such intense, almost moralizing language?
Because for a huge portion of the fan base, and for these specific critics, simplifying these three exiles into these equivalent crazy hermit tropes, it's not just seen as poor analysis. It's seen as a deliberate misrepresentation.
One that obscures the core narrative and thematic flaws of Luke's arc.
That's the heart of it. That emotional charge is the key. The debate isn't about whether they physically hid. Of course they did. The debate is about the why.
And the what for.
Exactly. The critics are saying the analogy is morally and thematically bankrupt. So the stage is set. We have this superficial similarity hiding versus the narrative reality, which is purpose and context.
According to the critics, the key difference isn't the physical act of exile, it's the reason and the purpose behind it. So let's start breaking down the traditional heroes first, to establish the baseline that the memes suppose.
We have to. We must first understand the foundation of what Obi-Wan and Yoda were doing to even begin to appreciate the critique. So if we look at Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi, their exile is rooted in this existential galaxy-wide context that was established with meticulous care at the end of Revenge of the Sith.
Right.
They didn't choose exile because of, a simple personal failure in training one problematic student. They were forced into hiding because their entire civilization,
The Jedi
Order, which had stood for 1,000 generations, was annihilated. It was a systemic galaxy-wide coup.
And this is such a crucial distinction that the analogy just willfully ignores. This wasn't a retreat driven by shame or disappointment. It was a tactical necessity. It was driven by an external, overwhelming genocide.
It was. The source material is crystal clear on this. They went into exile after the fall of the Republic and the execution of Order 66. The newly formed Galactic Empire was actively hunting down and murdering every single surviving Jedi.
They weren't just sad and retiring. They were the last vestiges of a dying, and they were trying to survive long enough to group.
I mean, think about the scope of. They weren't reacting to a moment of personal weakness. They were reacting to a geopolitical catastrophe.
A complete paradigm shift for the whole galaxy.
The decision to disappear was a strategic move made by the surviving highest-ranking leadership Yoda and Obi-Wan to ensure that hope could continue.
And the source stresses this over and over again. Their exile was done with purpose?
Yes, to continue the fight against the Sith and the Galactic Empire.
And that purpose was defined in their final conversation, wasn't it? Until the time is right, disappear we.
That is the language of preparation. That is strategy. It's not abandonment and it's not defeat.
They recognized the overwhelming power of Palpatine's new empire. They knew that a direct fight would just mean their immediate death and the end of the Jedi.
So exile was their highest possible strategic. It was the only move they had left on.
And Obi-Wan's role is maybe the most clearly defined, which makes that crazed hermit label particularly, egregious for his character.
It really is. He didn't just wander off into the desert to sulk. He went to Tatooine to take on this solemn, essential, and highly defined responsibility.
Watching over Luke Skywalker.
Exactly. And this was not just babysitting. This was ensuring the physical safety of the galaxy's new hope. It was a mission with immediate, physical, and long-term strategic goals, even if it was a mission of just vigilance and waiting that ended up lasting 20 years.
I think we need to slow down here and really drill into Yoda's actions while he was in solitude, because this is probably the strongest piece of evidence against the meme's claim.
It is.
The sources remind us that Yoda, who is far from being some broken retired master, provides a specific high-level spiritual assignment for Obi-Wan while he's waiting on Tatooine.
The quote is definitive, and we really need to break it down. Yoda tells him, "In your solitude on Tatooine training, I have for you an old friend has learned the path to immortality, one who has returned from the netherworld of the Force, your old master. How to commune with him, I will teach you."
Okay, wait, that is an extraordinary command. Let's just analyze what that mandate truly. He's not telling Obi-Wan, go meditate on your failure. He's giving him a task that represents the next evolution of Jedi knowledge.
Yes, Obi-Wan's mission, running parallel to guarding Luke, is to master communication with the Force ghost of Qui-Gon Jinn.
This is the critical piece of information that just completely invalidates the crazed hermit trope. To learn the path to immortality means you're engaging in advanced, esoteric, highly sophisticated spiritual training.
It's not something you do casually. It requires intense focus, deep meditation, and an active attempt to connect with the cosmos in a way that really no living Jedi had successfully done.
It's the furthest thing from aimless wandering or mental deterioration.
It is. Yoda, even in his own exile, is actively coordinating the transfer of what you could call advanced spiritual technology. He's making sure the future Jedi have tools that the old order lacked.
That's active, strategic, high-stakes planning. He's essentially saying, while the Emperor controls the physical galaxy, we will master the metaphysical galaxy.
Yes.
They are using their forced exile as a chance for self-improvement. They're developing the necessary infrastructure, both physical with Luke and spiritual with Force ghosts, for the inevitable comeback.
And the sources use this information to challenge Conrad's claim directly. If they were truly crazed hermits, they wouldn't be coordinating a highly organized long-term plan involving the safety of the galaxy's future, the protection of the only hope, and mastering these esoteric Force abilities that literally redefine life after death.
The text specifically rebuts the crazed hermit claim for Obi-Wan. It notes that it's impossible to interpret him as genuinely crazed when he's so faithfully carrying out his purpose.
And we see the proof of that. The source points to the scene where he lounges with Luke and explains the Force to him after he saves him from the Sand People.
He's clearly functional, rational, and engaged the moment the plot needs him to be.
And Yoda's eccentric behavior in the Empire strikes back. Well, the critique reminds us that was consciously put on. It was an act.
It's a classic narrative trope, isn't it? The master tests the student with absurdity.
Exactly. The moment Luke demonstrated the necessary seriousness, Yoda immediately dropped the act and fully committed to training him as a Jedi Master. This intentional deception for pedagogical reasons, a test of patience and perception, that is a world away from actual mental deterioration or just being crazed.
So if we look at the analogy critically, the first two parts just fail. The premise that they were driven by shame and became crazy is demonstrably false based on the establisher.
Their exiles were strategic, they were systemic, and they were driven by an active, albeit long-term, mission. They were guardians in waiting.
And this structural foundation exile, rooted in overwhelming external necessity and imbued with a high-level mission, is absolutely essential for understanding why Luke's scenario, as established in The Last Jedi, is seen as a complete narrative betrayal by the critic.
It moves the discussion from simple circumstance to a massive thematic contradiction.
All right, now we shift focus to Luke Skywalker. And this is where we have to dive deep into the psychological ramification of his action. His exile, according to the sources and the narrative of The Last Jedi, is rooted in a profoundly different kind of catalyst.
It's a profound personal and moral failing.
And the catalyst is singular, it's emotionally devastating, and it is entirely self. Luke reveals to Rey that he attempted to murder his own nephew, Ben Solo, after sensing the dark side was powerful.
And it's not about Ben turning dark. It's entirely about Luke's immediate, lethal, and destructive reaction to just the possibility of it.
Let's meticulously break down that moment, the central traumatic event that Luke recalls. He goes into Ben. He senses this potential for darkness, and in that split second, the source confirmed, he literally goes in there. He has the intent to murder him. He has the lights.
It's an act of preemptive, lethal violence against a sleeping family, against his own students.
He had crossed the line that really throughout the entire original trilogy had defined his character. His intent was lethal, and it was driven by fear and panic at just a glimpse of...
And while Luke does immediately realize the magnitude of his error, he has that split-second realization, what am I doing?
It was too late.
Way too late. Ben woke up, saw the drawn, activated lightsaber hovering over him, felt that absolute fear and betrayal.
And he brought the temple down on the other students, fled, and became Kylo.
So that moment of intent, even though it was quickly retracted, is the core trauma that triggers the exile. It's the moment Luke betrayed his own moral code. And Luke's own self-assessment, which is quoted directly in our source material, really emphasizes his intense personal guilt and failure. He says, "I was left with the same and with consequence, and the last thing I saw were the eyes of a frightened boy whose master had failed him."
That quote confirms the internal nature of the fear, doesn't it?
Completely. Yoda and Obi-Wan were failures of circumstance. They failed to save the Republic and the Order from an overwhelming external enemy in Palpatine. Luke's failure was internal, it was moral, and it was fundamentally a failure of faith.
He failed himself, failed his nephew, and he failed the core lesson that he learned about redemption and hope on the second Death Star.
And this personal failing, tragic in itself, leads directly to what the critics characterize as an even greater moral failing, his complete abandonment of the galaxy.
Right. And this is where the film's narrative is specifically challenged by Rey. She's the one highlighting the thematic content in this.
Yes, Rey delivers this just blistering lecture to him. She argues that Luke failed Ben not just by drawing the lightsaber, but, and I'm quoting, by thinking his choice was made, it wasn't.
She points out the obvious parallel, that Luke should have seen the conflict and the vulnerability in Ben just as he did in Darth Vader. She's literally calling on Luke to be the hero he was 20 years ago.
Think about the narrative weight of that scene. Rey is asking him, essentially, why he didn't apply the boundless faith and optimism used to redeem his own genocidal father.
The man responsible for just unimaginable atrocities.
It was conflicted nephew, who was just showing signs of dark. The critique argues that Luke's failure isn't just a mistake, it's a thematic and psychological regression of the highest order.
But Luke refuses the call to action. He refuses the responsibility. He ignores Rey's plea to come back and stop Ben. He physically turns away when she offers him his father's light.
And the critique just hammers this point home. Luke goes into hiding because of his personal moral failing. He's afraid of his own darkness and his own power. And that decision, that single decision, leads to him allowing the First Order to move completely unchecked into the galaxy.
And engage in massive mass murder and widespread destruction, all while he sits on an island doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah, phrase used by the critics, hides like a coward, is used explicitly because the source material argues that Luke's primary motivation is self-punishment and fear of repeating his mistake. It's not strategic preservation.
And that's the crucial counterpoint to the Obi-Wan and Yoda comparison.
While they were hiding strategically to protect the future, the lineage, the hope, the specialized knowledge Luke is hiding out of shame and fear of his own power.
He is effectively condemning the present generation to the horrors of the First Order. He's allowing mass suffering because of his own individual shame.
Which shifts the motivation from strategic necessity to a kind of self-punishing desert. And that fundamentally alters the character's moral standing within the larger Star Wars narrative.
It changes everything. It means Luke's exile isn't a planned sabbatical. It's an abdication of responsibility. The failure isn't just the moment he drew the lightsaber. The bigger failure is the decade he spent watching the galaxy burn because too ashamed to act.
That is the core reason the analogy just completely collapses for the critics. So now that we've meticulously detailed the foundational differences in context and motivation, we can really synthesize the fan critique against Conrad's analogy. We can move beyond a simple emotional reaction and get to clear narrative logic.
Let's establish a clear matrix of comparison, pulling directly from the critics' argument. The motive difference is paramount.
It is.
Yoda and Obi-Wan were forced into exile. It was due to the systemic collapse of the Republic, an overwhelming external event that extinguished their entire infrastructure. They had no viable choice but here.
But Luke, conversely, chose to abandon the galaxy. Why? Because he didn't trust himself after seeing evil in his nephew.
That distinction forced by systemic war versus chosen by psychological failure, that is the narrative cliff edge.
It is. When a hero is forced into a tragic circumstance, the audience sympathizes with their plight. You admire their ability to persevere. But when a hero chooses to retreat in fear, allowing widespread devastation to happen because they lack the courage to face their own mistake,
the audience might feel betrayed.
Especially if that choice contradicts the moral resolution they already achieved in their previous character arc.
We can also look at the difference in the intended outcome. One critic, who was quoted in the source material, crystallized this perfectly. He said Yoda and Obi-Wan went into hiding to prepare an eventual comeback.
Their exile was about survival and preparation for the decisive moment. Luke, however, fights, wins, and goes into hiding to die.
That is a profound difference in trajectory.
Oh, absolutely. Yoda and Obi-Wan's retreat was an active waiting period. It was focused on rebuilding, training Luke, mastering the Force Ghost. Luke's retreat, as it's shown, was about passive self-destruction and resignation. He intended for the Jedi to end with him.
That attitude, active preservation versus passive resignation, just irreconcilable.
And here's where the analysis really focuses on the central thematic conflict that the source material identified. Luke's final decision fundamentally contradicts his past character.
This is the ultimate core reason the fan base revolted. It's not just because they didn't like another Jedi retire.
The strongest criticism hinges entirely on Luke's history with Darth Vader. We have to remember that Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi was the one character, only character, who had this unwavering faith that his father, Darth Vader, the genocidal hand of the Emperor, was redeemable.
He was willing to die to prove that potential for good still exists.
And the critique asks us to believe that this same person, the man of hope, the man who stared down the most evil person in the universe and saw light, would then decide to, on the spot, murder his nephew in his sleep because he sensed some dark.
That psychological and thematic leap is it's too far for many viewers to accept.
It represents a total narrative discontinuity. Luke's previous arc was all about boundless optimism, unwavering patience, and faith in the potential for good, even in the face of overwhelm.
And to see him just discard that hard-won wisdom, that faith in redemption, when faced with his troubled nephew, it's seen as a wholesale butchering of the character.
It's rejection of the foundational themes that were established in the original trilogy.
Yeah.
The character growth was simply erased to service a new plot requirement.
Okay, let's momentarily entertain the original analogy's merit, fair, to make sure we're being balanced.
Sure.
If you completely strip away 20 years of context, the surface level comparison is They all failed, they all went into exile, and they all became eccentric.
But the moment you introduce the intent, the parallel just dissolves.
Completely. The source material spends a lot of time dismantling that surface. The Luke we see in The Last Jedi is one who succumbs instant fear and doubt. He abandons his responsibilities instead of facing the consequences.
Whereas the Luke who faced the Emperor demonstrated unparalleled moral courage. The current Luke demonstrates profound cowardice, according to these critics.
And this leads us to a fascinating but kind of heartbreaking footnote that's mentioned in the... Mark Hamill himself, the actor, had initially admitted he disliked the characterization.
Before changing his public stance later on.
Right.
And this is a point worth dedicating a moment to because it adds a layer of context beyond just the fictional debate. The source suggests that Hamill's shift in attitude was possibly due to external pressure or, politics.
What does that reveal, though?
It suggests that the actor, the person who embodies the character, initially recognized the jarring nature of the regression. He saw the narrative disconnect that the fans were reacting to. When the actor who lived the character's growth over decades raises a flag, it provides an additional layer of validation to the thematic criticism.
It speaks to that struggle between a new creative vision and established character integrity. The studio or the director may have needed Luke to be gone for the new trilogy to happen, but achieving that exit in a way that felt authentic to the character built a film, well, it proved disastrous device.
It confirms that the discomfort isn't just an external fandom reaction. It was recognized internally by the creative forces involved, at least initial. That disagreement over the consistency of Luke's moral framework is therefore central to understanding why that defense analogy failed so dramatically.
So, after this extensive deep dive into the purpose, the context, the character psychology of these three exiles, what does this all mean for you, the learner? This specific Star Wars fight really offers a perfect template for analyzing narrative structure in any complex story.
The key takeaway is this. Surface-level analogies, like comparing three people who went into hiding, often conceal deep, irreconcilable narrative differences, and those are based on purpose, context, and established character.
So critical thinking requires looking beyond just the basic plot points.
Exactly. You have to examine the intent of the characters involved, the scope of their failure, and the consequences of their subsequent acts.
We've established a very clear contrast. Yoda and Obi-Wan were executing a tactical retreat. It was driven by an overwhelming external systemic collapse and defined by an active mission to protect the future hope and develop new spiritual knowledge.
Whereas Luke's retreat was a chosen abandonment. It was driven by a personal moral failure, which critics argue led directly to the unnecessary death and destruction of innocence because he refused to correct his own mistake.
The difference between a strategic guardian and a moral deserter is really the heart of the matter.
And the intense, immediate reaction to Conrad's post, the fact he had to limit the comments, the rush to publish critical articles using terms like cope-out, it just demonstrates the high-stakes fans place on consistent characterization. It shows the powerful role fictional characters play in defining the narrative universe.
The debate isn't merely about a movie.
No, it is about narrative accountability. It's about what constitutes a valid, non-misleading defense of a major creative choice.
And here is where it gets really... A final thought for you to chew on that builds directly on the source material's arc. The sources confirm Luke had a moment of immediate realization. He saw his mistake in drawing the lights. He noted, "What am I doing?" He recognized his transgression.
So if he realized that attempting to murder Ben was a mistake, a profoundly wrong moral step, why did he choose exile instead of immediately trying to correct that mistake?
Why didn't he pursue Ben Solo, apologize for his failure, and try to stop Kylo Ren and the First Order from rising?
Does the realization of profound moral error necessitate an attempt at immediate redemption in action to mitigate the harm? Or is retreat an understandable, if selfish, reaction to such a colossal failure of self-trust?
The narrative chose retreat and despair. And that choice, the decision to sit down and do nothing, is what fuels this decade-long debate. And it ultimately invalidates the comparison to the active, mission-driven exile of his two men.
That, perhaps, is the greatest failure of all.